Good morning, everyone, and welcome inside on this frigid day. I'm very, very glad to see all of you. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. And on behalf of all the organizations that are co-sponsoring today's events, I want to welcome you here today. This is the second year of this program. And I want to emphasize that it's very much a collaborative effort. It involves the Dickey Center, the Rockefeller Center, the Tucker Foundation, the Off-Campus Programs Office, the Office of Undergraduate Advising and Research, the Office of Institutional Diversity and Equity, and the Office of Pluralism and Leadership. All of us have programs overseas, and all of us are cooperating in this effort. And before getting started today, I wanted to ask the members of the committee in the brochures for this event today. You'll notice in the inside first page, there's a picture of all the individuals who've worked on this, but these meetings have taken place at the Dickey Center, and I'm very familiar with the amount of work and the amount of preparation that has gone into today's events. So I would simply like to ask all the members of the organizing committee to stand and be recognized for their outstanding efforts. This conference on the Forum of Global Learning highlights the broad range of ways Dartmouth students are engaging with the world, and very importantly, it provides the opportunity for them to share their reflections on their own learning process and what they've experienced overseas. This conference very strongly supports our institutional goal of creating global citizens and encourages us to consider some of the vital global issues of the day. The forum gives participants an opportunity to travel around the world without leaving Hanover. And the hope is that those of you attending today will leave inspired and challenged to reflect on your own cross-cultural learning goals. Today, there will be 30 different student presentations throughout the day, each monitored by a Dartmouth faculty member. There will be a networking reception at 4 p.m. today in the Russo Lounge on the first floor here, hosted by Deans Lindsay Whaley and Ingalise Amir. And there are also going to be visiting professionals and alumni who are working on social justice projects with a global focus who will be attending. So please, feel free to attend all these events during the course of the day and the reception at 4 o'clock. And I invite you to spend the day with us learning about the world and reflecting on how our opportunities at Dartmouth create positive change in the world. I would add also that this program is offered in conjunction with the Dartmouth Martin Luther King celebration events. And I'm very privileged and proud now to ask the president of Dartmouth, Dr. Yong to introduce our featured speaker. And I think Jim Kim's life and work at Dartmouth really reflect all that we're doing here today. The goals of Martin Luther King social justice certainly are so strongly reflected in what Jim did in his previous life, bringing medical care to the poor and underprivileged around the world. And certainly since his time here at Dartmouth, he's been such a very vocal and very effective spokesman for internationalism and the importance of Dartmouth students being global citizens. So I'm very pleased to turn the floor to President Kim.
First, I want to congratulate a great program. I was looking at the range of discussions and encourage everyone to stay. You're taking on some really, really important issues. My job here, though, is not to give a presentation, but just to introduce my friend, Jose Fernandez. But before I do that, I want to reflect just a bit on how important Martin Luther King has been for me in all of my international health work. You know, when I was leaving the World Health Organization, my coworkers in the HIV department made a little sort of funny plaque for me and gave it to me. And they said that the title of it was Patient Zero has been identified in the epidemic of rampant optimism in the UN, right? So it was really a wonderful, both a joke and their own testament to me. But one of the things I said is that I had been expelled from the United Nations because I had violated the law of not being allowed to quote Martin Luther King every day I worked in the UN. And I did. I quoted him all the time. In fact, when we launched our 3x5 campaign, which was an effort to get 3 million people on treatment for HIV by the end of 2005, we were working against some of the most powerful and the most wealthy, the most influential people in the world who had looked at the 30 million people who were not receiving treatment in Africa for HIV and had said directly, you know, I think in Africa, we're really talking about the next generation. So some of the most powerful, influential, well-respected people in the world had said that HIV treatment in Africa is just not going to be possible. It's too expensive. It's not cost effective. All kinds of reasoning behind it. But can you imagine? It's hard to imagine today. But back in those days, what they were saying was that for the 30 million people infected with HIV in Africa, I'm sorry, but you're all dead. And this is what the leaders were saying. So when we looked at what can we do to change fundamentally the way that we think about this problem, I looked to Reverend King. And it's the famous statement, and I won't read it to you. I read it so often to so many people. But it is so important in our celebration because the theme is injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That comes from about the first 5 paragraphs of Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And what he's talking about is the charge that he is an outsider in Birmingham. So the actual line in his speech is that I am here in Birmingham from Atlanta because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He was talking about Atlanta, Georgia to Birmingham, Alabama. But also in that speech, he gave his own thesis on time that has been an important moral guide for me since I read those words. And part of the Letter from a Birmingham Jail actually quoted one of the so-called sympathetic white ministers who had been telling him to move away from direct action and let any reform happen in the courts. And this gentleman wrote to him that you are in too great a theological hurry. It takes time for the lessons of Christ to come to earth. Now, the Letter from a Birmingham Jail is actually, you can find it in a book called Why We Can't Wait. So for about 6 years, the title of every one of my talks on HIV were subtitled Why We Can't Wait. And the quote that I used every single time I spoke was Martin Luther King's response to the white theologian who said that the lessons of Christ take time to come to earth. And of course, Reverend King said that he had a fundamental misunderstanding of time, that time does not cure all ills, that justice does not roll in, he said, on the wheels of inevitability. And of course, he also said that one has to take action, and that he fears not so much the cries and noise of the bad people, but he fears even more the silence of the good people. So by being here today, all the different topics, you're not being silent, and I applaud all of you for that. But Dr. King also set out some pretty tough goals for us to reach. In that letter to Birmingham jail, he talked about 4 different ways that they were moving forth in their nonviolent protest. The first was to collect data. Now you hear me talk about that all the time, collect the data. But they were collecting the evidence for the existence of injustice. That was the first step. The second step was negotiation. He believed that you needed to give people an opportunity to state their views and to negotiate with them in good faith. Third was what he called self-purification. Can you imagine? Self-purification. For him in Birmingham, self-purification meant making sure that everyone was truly ready to get involved in nonviolent protests. So he had to go through sessions where he actually challenged people. Will you respond with nonviolence when you are battered and you have fire hoses turned on you? Are you ready to do that? And moreover, are you ready to sit in jail when they put you in jail? And so it's a lesson that has never escaped me, that if you want to do great things in the world, your fervor at injustice is not enough. You've got to think about who you are. And while the notion of purification strikes me as difficult because I don't think one can ever get there, but the sense that your own self has to be transformed if you're going to be good at working for justice, I think was really an important point. And then finally, the fourth point that was part of his response was direct action. Many of you in this room have taken direct action, which is fantastic. And I think we have to constantly remind ourselves that there is a lot of terrible stuff going on in the world. Soldiers are still using rape as a weapon in southern Sudan. The Haiti earthquake still begs for our attention and intervention. There are Native American tribes today in which the life expectancy is lower than any African country I've ever worked in. 45 years for some of the Native American tribes. So Dr. King knew that when he said injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, he knew that in fact that was wrong, that it doesn't really threaten justice everywhere. The fact that Native Americans have a life expectancy of 46 does not affect us here as much as it should. What he was saying was not he was not saying that that's the way it is. That's the way it was for him. But as anthropologists like to say about culture, when he said that, it was both a model of and a model for. He was saying that for him, that's the way he's approaching the world, that an injustice in Birmingham does not elude his own sense of moral purpose in Atlanta, therefore he's in Birmingham. Can we do that here at Dartmouth? Hanover is a long way from the places where Native Americans are suffering from terrible life expectancy. It's even further away from places like southern Sudan. But I think that here at the Dickey Center and the extraordinary faculty and students we have, it strikes me that we are every day trying to live up to this notion that justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and we must continue. Just because we don't pay attention to it doesn't mean it's not happening. So let me then go on to thank Jose Fernandez for this job. Jose was on the search committee that gave me this job. It was wonderful to meet him at first. My wife still doesn't understand why they gave me this job, because she kept saying, why would they ever give you the job of being president of Dartmouth College? But I'm grateful nonetheless. Jose is really one of our superstar alums. He graduated in 1977, magna cum laude with high honors. He was a Dartmouth honorary degree recipient. He graduated from Columbia University School of Law, received a JD. More importantly, he is the father of Sarah Fernandez, class of 2014, right here in the front. His wife Andrea is a noted scholar. She wrote one of the best books on W. Edwards Deming, which is still extremely, extremely important to me as we try to bring the greatest insights from the quality improvement in other areas here to Dartmouth, and I thank her for being here today. But I want to say that, Jose is one of the most distinguished, one of the most successful. He was involved in an extremely successful law career in New York City at the office of Latham and Watkins. He was doing very exciting work in global and international law with a specialty in Latin America, was noted as one of the most distinguished and most effective lawyers working in Latin America and across national boundaries. And in the middle of all that, he chose to leave that practice and work in the United States State Department. That was a decision that didn't surprise any of us who had gotten to know him, that we knew that he had always been committed to service. He provided extraordinary service to Dartmouth College. But we now have the wonderful opportunity to hear from him after now more than a year working in President Obama's administration. I say all the time that the most important lesson is the lesson that John Sloan Dickey himself gave to all of us. He came here in 1946. Some of you will know that on August 9th, 1945, John Sloan Dickey was named the next president of Dartmouth College. And soon thereafter, the United States dropped nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in that month, as a matter of fact. John Sloan Dickey, when he was named president of Dartmouth College, was in the position of being the head of public relations at the U.S. State Department. So in the very month that he was named president of Dartmouth College, he had to go out and defend the U.S. dropping of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so a year later, when he came here for his first convocation, he said those great words. I want you to know two things. First, that the world's troubles are your troubles. But secondly, that there's nothing wrong with the world that better human beings cannot fix. And then he set about for the next 25 years trying to build the better human beings that would prevent us from blowing each other off the face of the planet with the use of nuclear weapons. I can't think of a better person to embody that spirit of making the world's troubles your troubles. It is my great privilege to introduce to you Jose Fernandez from the class of 1977.
Good morning. And thank you, Jim, for that warm introduction. Not a day goes by that I'm here that I'm so glad that we made the right choice, and I'm delighted. Thank you also to the Dickey Center, to Ken Yalowitz. You know, I was in the Republic of Georgia early on in my tenure at the State Department, and I was asked by the Prime Minister of Georgia to come and talk to him. And that was pretty nice. You know, I was used to seeing my counterpart at the State Department, not a prime minister. And I thought that he wanted to talk about Russia and economic relations. And he said, no, I've got one thing to tell you. I want you to tell Ken Yalowitz that we miss him dearly. And so thank you very much. And I bring you greetings from Misha Saakashvili, who thinks the world of you. So thank you all of you for having me here. Today would have been the 82nd birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King. This day also celebrates the 25th anniversary of the holiday that honors his life, the only federal holiday that commemorates someone who was not a president. But this year also marks another anniversary, an anniversary that's a little bit dearer to those of us here at Dartmouth, but isn't terribly well known outside of Dartmouth. 50 years ago, in 1961, Reverend King was scheduled to preach at Rollins Chapel. But on the day that he was supposed to come, one of his aides called the college chaplain to tell him that Dr. King wouldn't make it. He'd been jailed in Montgomery, Alabama, for taking part in the demonstrations against segregation there. And so at the last minute, the chaplain had to come up with a sermon on peace, on global health, and something else. Dr. King was invited back and finally addressed the college the following year. And when he did, he excused himself for having canceled his previous engagement. And this is what he said. I am very happy, he apologized with just a little touch of irony. I am very happy that my criminal instincts were suppressed, at least for now, so that I didn't have to be in jail this time, and I could have the privilege of sharing with you on this occasion. I think it's also fitting that we celebrate Martin Luther King Day at colleges and universities around the country, for Dr. King was both inspired by and relied upon students. It was students, 50 of them standing single file, some just in elementary and in grade school, who insisted against Dr. King's wishes on marching out of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, knowing that a crowd of grown men, some armed with baseball bats, dogs, and water cannons, waited for them under the approving eye of the local police. Those kids knew that if they were lucky, that if they were really lucky, they would spend that night in jail. What they couldn't have known, of course, was that the riveting pictures of school children cowering against snarling dogs and water hoses would turn the world's attention to the civil rights movement in 1963. It was university students, 1,000 of them of all races and colors, who came together with local residents in 1964 and 1965 to register American voters in Mississippi during the Freedom Summers. One of them was a Dartmouth sophomore. His name was Peter. I haven't been able to figure out his last name, who in 1965 wrote a letter to his friends from Adams County Jail, where he was. And I found this letter, of all places, in the Brown University archives. And yes, Dr. Kim, Brown can put out some good product. The letter was about 3 pages long. It would have been 3 pages long if Peter had been able to type it. But it was written on toilet paper and smuggled out of jail in order to avoid the censors. With exquisite Dartmouth understatement, Peter began by apologizing for his choice of paper. This is what he said. The stationery, he said, is a bit unorthodox. Corny, to say the least, but there was nothing else to write on here. Besides, a letter written on toilet paper and smuggled from jail is a lot more thrilling and civil rightsy. Peter then describes being beaten for nothing more than standing next to picket lines, of having been locked up 4 times in 7 weeks, and of his current fear that the local sheriff will put a couple of local hoods in his jail to beat him up. And then he closes by saying, "Please don't mention any of this to my father or mother," he closes, "for it might scare them. I will be back at Dartmouth next year." There was another student from those Freedom Summers whose name is Roger Daly. Daly quit Dartmouth in the middle of his sophomore year in 1965 and took a bus from New York City to Jackson, Mississippi to join the movement. Daly had met Dr. King a few years earlier at an exclusive boarding school where he was, and had spent at that time hours talking to Dr. King then about nonviolence. That experience, Daly told me a few days ago, changed his life. It became clear to me, he said, that there was a way to be loving and to hate injustice at the same time. That, he said, had been a conundrum to me. Like Peter before him, Daly would also experience the hardships of being jailed and beaten for his actions in the movement. But instead of learning to write letters on toilet paper, while incarcerated, he would learn to roll cigarettes from newspapers and make coffee from the water in the toilet bowl. "I was a scared young man in those days," he said to me last Thursday. "Whenever the window would roll down from a passing automobile, I didn't know whether a shotgun or a cigarette butt would emerge from the inside." On his last tour of the Mississippi jails, Mr. Daly, Pastor Daly, he's now a pastor in Chesterfield, New Hampshire, spent a day and a half in the jail with Dr. King, just the two of them alone. And he said that also changed my life. Well, at this point, you're probably asking yourself, what does Martin Luther King have to do with your speaker? After all, the Assistant Secretary of State for Economic, Energy, and Business Affairs isn't not an obvious choice to talk about Dr. King. Yet the more I read about Dr. King, the more I'm convinced that his legacy is critical to the areas that I work on. You see, we all remember Dr. King for his work in the civil rights movement, but sometimes we forget the equally important impact that he had on international and economic issues. In the last decade of his life, Dr. King devoted himself to the cause of economic justice everywhere. He spent the last part of his life working to end poverty through the Poor People's Campaign. And the very last day of his life was spent marching side by side with sanitation workers in protest of unfair wages and working conditions in Memphis, Tennessee. The fact of the matter, I've concluded, is that Martin Luther King Jr. was a committed internationalist. He was often asked about the relationship between international politics and his wider outlook. And when he was asked that question, he bristled. When I hear such questions, he would say, I'm greatly saddened, for they mean that those who ask it have really never known me, my commitment or my calling. Indeed, he would continue, the questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live. And so in the last few years of his life, Dr. King took on matters of U.S. foreign policy and came out strongly against the Vietnam War, even though his advisors warned him that it would put him on the wrong side of Lyndon Johnson, who in fact had been the one who had supported the Voting Acts right. King also understood that the world's economies were intimately linked. And listen to what he said before anyone even talked about globalization, before globalization was even a word in our lexicon. This is what he said. You get up in the morning and you reach over for a sponge, and that's handed to you by a Pacific Islander. You reach for a bar of soap, and that's given to you by the hands of a Frenchman. And then you go into the kitchen to drink your coffee for the morning, and that's poured into your cup by a South American. But maybe you want tea. That's poured into your cup by a Chinese. Or maybe you're desirous of having cocoa for breakfast, and that's poured into your cup by a West African. And then you reach for your toast, and that's given to you at the hands of an English-speaking farmer, not to mention the baker. And before you finish breakfast, he said, you've depended on more than half the world. So when reflecting on Dr. King's legacy, I would submit to you that even though he lived in an era before the term globalization had made its way into our vernacular, he fundamentally understood what it meant to live in an interconnected world. After a year in government, I have no doubt that Dr. King's teachings have much to tell us about the conduct of international economic, energy, and business affairs. Of course, as President Obama pointed out in his speech in Oslo when accepting the Nobel Prize, the American government has a mandate distinct from Dr. King's. We have a responsibility, as the President said, first and foremost to the American people. My principal duty is to make sure that the Department of State works for Americans and that it helps them to secure stable lives by contributing to job creation at home. My obligation, and this government's obligation, is to be the strongest advocate for our people. But I want to make this point. This administration, under the leadership of President Obama and Secretary Clinton, also understands, like Dr. King, what it means to be interconnected. The great challenges of our time, climate change, preserving peace, eradicating poverty, these are challenges that no one nation can solve alone, and we know that in this government. In my position, I'm keenly aware of the key link between prosperity at home and increased development abroad. My bureau at the State Department, Economic, Energy, and Business, and our economic offices in 271 missions around the globe have a fundamental vision of spearheading policies and projects that are at the nexus of doing well by doing good. We believe that the interests of the American people are best served when those in less developed countries are living better themselves. Not only does this help preserve global stability, but it creates a foundation for greater trade and economic opportunity for all, including Americans. But we're also keenly aware that the development needs globally far outweigh the resources that are available to meet them. If we were to write up a wish list, if we wrote up a wish list of just the economic needs of the billions of people around the world who live on less than $1 a day, that list would be in the trillions of dollars. These are the needs that our government and those of other wealthy nations cannot meet through traditional forms of international aid and current levels of foreign direct investment. And this is why, as we focus on development, we need to innovate, we need to coordinate with civil society and with other nations, with educational institutions, and we need to always look for greater efficiencies. We also need to leverage the resources of the private sector as we work to meet the challenges of climate change, poverty, and hunger everywhere. Just as Dr. King recognized the profound interconnectedness of people everywhere, this administration recognizes the interconnectedness between profit and purpose, between the power of the private sector and the passion of the people who wish to serve the poor. We can help lift people out of poverty now while also laying the groundwork for new market opportunities in the future. We can help nascent and fragile democratic governments everywhere transition to developed nations. Just to be clear, this is not simply a blind faith from an old corporate lawyer in free markets, or a belief that if government just abandons the public sphere to the invisible hand, we will take care of all of the world's problems. Instead, this is a focus that's based on maximizing the impact where private interest and public goals overlap. And we've started to do this. We've started to work on this. We've done this by starting to rebuild the electricity sector in Haiti using the private sector in order to bring the lights back on in the wake of last year's devastating earthquake. We're doing this through the Food Security Initiative, the Feed the Future Initiative at the State Department, where we're helping African farmers learn better ways to use efficient irrigation systems and tap into opportunities in the agricultural supply chain so that they can help their communities find sustainable ways to eradicate hunger that will not depend on governments just cutting checks for development. And if we can create partnerships between U.S. agricultural companies and some African nations, we may be able to make a dent in the problems of soil erosion, drought, and climate change that affect the continent. We're also doing this by harnessing the massive multi-billion-dollar flow of worker remittances from wealthy countries. $300 billion a year worldwide, $60 billion just from the US to Latin America a year alone. We're harnessing this flow of worker remittances to poorer countries for something more than consumption of basic food and other daily needs. We're partnering with banks and financial institutions in recipient countries to find a double impact from these remittance flows, such as the building of schools and hospitals and airports in the countries where workers send their hard-earned money to their loved ones. So that, for example, when the Salvadorian waiter down the street sends a check to her kids, she will know that it's not only helping to put food on the table at home, back home in El Salvador, but also helping to keep the lights on in her kid's classroom. And finally, we're trying to do this in the diamond extractive industry with the Kimberley process by working with industry, with consumer countries, and producing nations to end the trade in blood diamonds that fuel civil wars and human rights abuses in Africa. People ask me sometimes why we focus so much on development instead of simply helping U.S. business abroad. Well, we do that too. That's what I answer. We do that as well. But my answer to this question is also that we all bring our own experiences into our work, and that I can never forget mine. A few years ago, I went back to my hometown in Cuba with my dad. It was a wonderful trip, just the two of us, seeing where he had been born, and where I played as a child before coming over at the age of 11 to this country. And everywhere I saw children playing in the street, some shirtless, some shoeless, but most of them with no future. And it became even more clear to me that for the grace of God and the courage of my parents, I could have been one of those children. And that's the lesson that I bring into government. We're not that far removed from the poorest, even here in Hanover. And Dr. King said it. He said, all life is interrelated. We're all caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And so as I travel around the world and see children dart around the cars in El Salvador to beg for a scrap of food, or farmers who cannot work their fields in Ghana, I say I've seen this for too long. I've been in government for a year. I was in the private sector working on international legal issues 30 years ago. And for the most part, the problems that I saw 30 years ago are here today. Yeah, there have been some success stories around the world, And yes, we've got to emulate these success stories, but we also have to do better. We also have to do better. We've got to use all of the resources available to us and work with the belief that this is not a zero-sum game, that if we can help others, we're also going to help ourselves as a nation. So let me conclude by telling you that as I too have read Dr. King in different periods of my life, and I sometimes ask myself whether Dr. King would have approved of our work in foreign policy. And when I do have concluded that he'd have his problems with some of our policies, especially those policies that have to do with war. But I think that overall he would have approved. He would have approved of our commitment to working with other nations, and he would have also approved of our attempts to use the power of the private sector to help solve some of the world's problems. You see, for all of the scathing criticism of America that you read when you read Dr. King's speeches, he believed in the ability of all of us in this country, black or white, rich or poor, to be a force for good. That's why he wouldn't heed Malcolm X's vision of a violent struggle against white supremacy. That's why he wouldn't heed Elijah Muhammad's call for a separate nation. Instead, Dr. King believed that Americans had the ability to live up to their ideals and to make a better world for themselves and to others. And that's still our challenge today. I hope that many of you in this audience will have the chance to apply Dr. King's lessons to this new and ever more complicated era of globalization. Be it in Cambodia or Colombia, Kentucky or Cleveland, think of the kids. Think of the kids who don't go to school and instead need to beg to stop cars at red lights. Think of their equivalents. It's probably too early in your lives to focus on this, but think of the world that we will be leaving these kids. Will it be a world where we think only of zero-sum games or all-or-nothing battles? Or will it be a world where we work together to achieve the joint prosperity, greater justice, and understanding that Dr. King dreamed of? I hope all of you have the opportunities in your careers, no matter what your calling may be, to find creative ways to serve. And thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That was so thoughtful and so inspiring. I might say, as a former U.S. government official and of the State Department, I just wanted to express my own pride and joy that someone of the quality of Jose Fernandez is fulfilling really brilliantly the job that he's now doing. And thank you very, very much. We'll be able to take questions for about 20 minutes. There are microphones. Let's see. Yeah, there's a student here with a microphone. He'll be circulating. Wait to ask your question until you have a microphone in front of you, please, because this is being recorded. So, who wants to ask a question?
That clear.
Who will be the first? Always the first. Your daughter. No?
Well, thank you.
Anybody? Please.
I'm wondering if you could tell us what, if anything, at Dartmouth helped prepare you for the work that you're doing now.
I'm a big supporter of the liberal arts. Here I was interested in all, from anthropology to history, to geography. It really, Dartmouth has an effect on people that depends on where they've come from. In my case, I came from an urban, you'd call it an urban setting. I hadn't met people outside of my own little circle back in New Jersey. And I met people from Cyprus to Maine, and learning how to deal with different people is something that is critically important today. I mean, if traveling one day to North Africa to another day to Europe, I think you learn to meet those people. And if there's one thing that I will put money on is that those kinds of skills that you learn at Dartmouth, be with people that are different from you, that's going to be critical. You cannot overstate that. And you'd be surprised how rare that is sometimes in government. People expect, just because someone speaks English, doesn't mean that they're the same as you. It doesn't mean that they have different beliefs, doesn't mean that they have different needs. And so that's critical, and that's something we need to continue to work on. People are different, and that's something that Dartmouth will teach you.
Yep, in the back.
Thanks a lot for coming, and thanks a lot for the great speech. I had a quick question about, a lot of us are moving on to the real world next year, and I had a quick question about how you balance your personal life and then pursuing your passion and career, and how you have dealt with that over the years. Thank you.
Oh man, I thought I was here to talk about foreign policy, not about. You may want to ask my wife, who's here, and my kids, how I balance my personal life. The fact of the matter is, I probably haven't been as successful as I should have been. I think the work that I do now is frankly all-encompassing. 14, 15-hour days. I'm away from my family Monday through Thursday, and get home on Friday nights. I sort of assuage my guilt by saying I'll be home for dinner on Friday night, so it's only 3 nights, only 4 nights away. Fact of the matter is that when you go into the real world, you'll have to make some sacrifices. It's nothing that you can be good at doesn't take a lot of time, and so time and commitment. And I think the secret is to find something you're really passionate about that doesn't feel like work, and that's critical, and that's rare. There have been times in my work as a lawyer that I said, why am I doing this? It's good money. But I really don't want to be doing this. I've done it already. I'm not growing. I'm not learning. And so that's when the time comes to, if you're not learning, if you're not growing, it's maybe time to do something else.
Yep, so here. Come down here. You'll be next and say hello.
I was wondering, you were talking about developing, helping countries like Haiti who have experienced really terrible things in recent history develop and become more sustainable. Do you ever come across a problem like energy that's cheaper and energy that's cleaner? And what do you do in those situations, Dad?
This is. No, you can take the mic away. This is a constant fight at home. This energy. It's the middle part of my job. We've got a spectrum. You've got on the one hand a president that's committed to renewable energy, to promoting renewable energy, who sees it as a way not just to combat climate change, but also to create American jobs. At the same time, you've got a reality, and that is that in the foreseeable future, oil will be our principal source of fuel. Yes, we're working on things such as shale gas that could actually change the debate. I mean, the whole shale gas work that's being done in this country could at some point make us energy independent. You also have countries that are still burning coal. And so that's a dispute that I have not just at home, but also in government. There have been projects that we've had to approve in countries in Africa, for example, to burn coal, major projects. And we know it's dirty, but at the same time, the choice you have to make is, are people going to be able to have power plants? Are people going to be able to have electricity so they can get jobs, so that they can grow some food, so that they can just simply not go hungry? And so that's frankly one of the ongoing debates that we have, and we don't have an answer other than we know what we want to be. We want to be at the renewable energy space, but getting there isn't exactly a direct line.
Right here.
Once again, thank you so much for coming out. And I have a question that is foreign policy related, but I think it's somewhat relevant to the whole idea of global society moving forward. And I guess as an international lawyer, what role do you see international law playing in terms of creating solutions? And I don't know, just in classes and in lectures, you hear all sorts of theories on how it's going to affect the world, but since you're a practitioner of foreign policy, I think you would probably have a pretty good insight.
I think when I went to law school, you know, when Abe Lincoln was president, people would say that international law was a law that was created by the winners to govern the losers. And there was also the law that it was optional, it was not mandatory. And that's still the case, especially in the public international law sphere. But the fact of the matter is that there are more and more, we're seeing international law become relevant. The International Criminal Court, for example, that's made a huge difference in many ways. There are things now that are going on to try and deprive dictators who plunder their countries and then go to France and live the good life on the coast, to find ways to take those monies away. There are now established norms for an investor in one country who gets expropriated to have recourse against a country that expropriates that company. There are ways now for if you rape and pillage in Congo, for you to be brought to justice. That doesn't mean that we're there yet. We still have a number of imperfect forms that are now the best that we have, but they're not perfect, and they're not even good, I would argue. One of them that I deal with in my job is what's called the Kimberley process. That's the process that governs blood diamonds. And how do you keep blood diamonds from, how do you discourage governments, and how do you discourage rebel groups from going out and beating people and then taking their diamonds? How do you discourage them from literally taking towns and taking them to the mine so that they can get the diamonds, and then you take that back and you either use it to beat up some more people or you use it to buy yourself a villa in southern France? We've started, but it's a process. And I think if there's anything that I've gained in my years in law is a belief that there's a place for law, but also a realization that we're not even close to being at the right spot. And I just, part of what I try and do in my little bailiwick is to encourage a legal process.
So, my question for you is, what is your view on American economic policies that might help American producers, such as farm subsidies and tariffs on sugarcane, that help American producers but hurt producers in other countries because they're unable to sell their products, like producers in the developing world that have trouble developing economically because of these protective economic policies?
We deal with those. We hear from Brazil all the time that that they can't sell their cotton here because of subsidies, or their sugar here. We hear from African countries that say that their agricultural products, even though we have it in our best intentions to promote African agriculture, that they can't sell them here. We're not perfect, and I'll be the first one to tell you that there's an argument to be made against those tariffs, but I'll also tell you that the political reality is that our farmers in some cases need protection, that there are jobs to be maintained here. Ultimately, our goal is to encourage free trade. Ultimately, what we're trying to do, and we just did one recently where we actually worked to open the border to Mexican trucks. That was just announced recently. Ultimately, our goal is free trade, but I'll be the first to tell you that it's not a direct road. And just like we hear complaints from this can be like a bad marital dispute sometimes. On the one hand, you will hear, well, you're not allowing our cotton in, and on the other hand, we'll say, well, yes, but you are not allowing us to invest in your country. You're not allowing us to set up companies in your country. You're taking our ideas and making them your own, and you're not enforcing our intellectual property rights. So it's part of an ongoing dialogue. We know what we want to be. Again, I keep saying that, but getting there is where it gets hard.
My name's Tom Luxon. I'm going to try a little more hardball here. This morning, we read in the New York Times that a prominent banker, offshore banker, is going to give Julian Assange the names of 2,000 tax evaders, corporations and individuals. And this leads me to ask the larger question. I know what the State Department's position is on WikiLeaks, but on the broader question of transparency and in global affairs, especially the State Department's affairs abroad, and the public's right to find things out. What's your own thoughts on these matters, upsides and downsides?
We at the State Department have been big supporters of internet freedom. Secretary Clinton has actually several times from early last year forward has been a tireless advocate of internet freedom. We spend a lot of time talking to countries about why internet freedom is in their interests, how it helps economic development. So I don't think anybody would argue that this administration has been at the forefront. Sometimes when it actually cuts against our economic interests, has been at the forefront of pursuing internet freedom, transparency, not just in the information space, but in a number of spaces as well. WikiLeaks is, it's the only thing I can say is stolen documents have not helped American diplomacy. It hasn't helped my work. I've had people who've refused to talk to me because of this. I've seen names that should have been crossed out that have not been crossed out we have there's a working group at the State Department to try and protect the people that have been whose lives have been endangered because of WikiLeaks. And at this point, that's serious stuff. When people have to leave their countries because they've talked to us, that's not right. And think of what it does to American foreign policy if I cannot assure someone who's talking to me privately that their privacy will be respected, that their lives will be endangered. So I maybe it's my legal background. I'm very much, I very much believe that it's an attack on our foreign policy. It's an attack on some of the best things we're trying to do, which is talk to human rights workers around the world. And why should those people's names be disclosed? And so I see no contradiction between, on the one hand, talking to China about the need for freedom of expression, and trying to protect our sources and the people that make some of the things that we do around the world that are good things, that we all would agree are good policies, how to protect our privacy in that space.
There's a question down
Talk a little bit about the balancing act of the State Department and in your job of between sort of the business and the humanitarian sides of things, or the big business corporations versus NGO, how you deal with that in your day-to-day lives, and what you would say to Dartmouth students perhaps who plan to go into the business side instead of the humanitarian side.
Well, as I've mentioned during the talk, I think there's a real business people are no angels necessarily. We've all seen some of the things some of the nasty stuff that business can do, and those of you who've read the Gulf oil spill report know that by cutting corners or by focusing on profits, business can actually do some damage. But I do believe that there's a convergence. There's a place where profit and development do intersect. That as a policy of my bureau is something that I personally have been pushing. I can give you a number of examples, but we could talk about promoting agriculture in Africa and finding ways to combat drought and hunger and climate change. Well, there are companies that actually can sell you seeds and can make some money doing that, and can also help African countries as they try and struggle with these things. There's counterfeit medicines. One of the I didn't talk about that in my talk, but there are countries out there, some of the African countries, 50% plus of their medicines are counterfeit or fake medicines. So you think you're taking an antibiotic, and you end up taking an aspirin or worse. And think of what that does. It kills people. If you're not killed, you get a new strain of a disease. So people like Evo Morales in Bolivia, who's no spokesperson for the pharmaceutical industry, have actually said counterfeit medicines, fake medicines are a problem in this country. We've got to do something about them. Well, there's something that U.S. companies can do as well. We can work with U.S. companies to try and stop counterfeit medicines. And if we do, we'll do two things. We'll keep people alive, and also, at the same time, help companies turn a profit so that they can sell their medicines as well. So it's not perfect, but there's a way for profit and for companies and development to intersect. NGOs play a critical role in a lot of what we do. If you think, for example, of the work that we're doing now in blood diamonds in Africa, well, that whole movement was started by NGOs. NGOs from the U.S., from the U.K., and other places, and who said it's morally wrong for you to get married with a diamond ring that's a product of someone's life. That kind of moral outrage is what fueled the Kimberley process, and that's what we, that's if we can work with those NGOs, I think we can actually improve lives, and we can help our country as well. So I think the trick is to keep all these different interests in balance, But I think you can bring you can bring NGOs into the picture. You can bring companies into the picture, just like you can bring educational institutions into the picture as well.
We're going to have to close because the individual sessions are about to begin. I just want to ask all of you, please, check the programs and go to one of the sessions, but most of all, to thank Jose again for an absolutely wonderful presentation.